Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's success story interview where we are speaking with Chelsea, who recently matched in the 2021 match. So, thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. So, yes, I'm Chelsea Azevedo. I'm a recent graduate of AUC American University of the Caribbean, and I recently matched into internal medicine at Creighton University at their Phoenix location. So, pretty close to home and excited about it.
Nice. What's are you most excited about for starting residency?
I mean, I think it's kind of just like the accumulation of everything you've worked so hard for kind of coming to fruition. I'm really excited about just being able to like use all the knowledge, obviously, that I've had the last 4 years and actually be the one that's kind of in charge of the patient care. So I'm excited about the new responsibility. I mean, obviously, I'm a little bit nervous about it too, but definitely excited for the upcoming responsibility and the transition from that medical student to intern, year. I'm excited for that.
Absolutely. So, can you tell us a little bit or a lot about what got you first involved or interested in medicine, and where did your journey begin?
Definitely. So kind of my journey is it's an interesting one. I've kind of always known I wanted to be a physician. I don't really know why. It's always been kind of a joke in my family. There's no one in medicine, even in my extended family. And I mean, in no way is anyone in medicine. So there's no nurses, no, physicians, no scientists, anything like that. So it's always been kind of a joke. Like I just came out of the womb wanting to be a doctor. That was something I always said I wanted to do. And I think the thing that really kind of solidified it for me, though, when I was 7 years old, I was actually diagnosed with type 1 diabetes.
Mm.
So, kind of this new phase of having to like be around doctors a lot, having to be in the hospital a lot, kind of dealing with all the changes that were happening in my own body and the changes that were happening around me. And I just noticed that during that time, like I guess I wasn't really nervous or scared of anything. If anything, I was more intrigued by the inner workings of the hospital and what was going on with me and things like that. So
Yeah.
being diabetic, I think, was kind of like a real big turning point for me because now I had so much exposure, to the medical field. And I remember being in the hospital, I think, for the first like month or so. Because back in the day, they would throw you in the hospital for about a month when you were diagnosed. And so I was there, and like I said, like there was really no anxiety or fear about being in the hospital. If anything, I was like the curious child running around the hospital asking a bunch of questions and whatnot. And that's kind of when I realized that this was like a real thing. So that never really changed for me. I went through high school, I went through college knowing I was going to become a doctor. I just didn't really know how. But I just kind of always knew. And I kind of always knew too that I wanted to pursue internal medicine because endocrinology has always been something that's been kind of on kind of a set thing, especially since I was about 7. So I would say that's kind of where the curiosity was sparked, was pretty young for sure.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Yes.
Um, so can you tell us more about your experience in high school and college and after college? Like, did you have the support or, the means, the trajectory kind of laid out for you,
Right.
or how did that go?
So definitely not. I think that is kind of a big part of my story is just how, windy it's been and kind of the different things I've done to get to this place. So I will say, in high school, I definitely had kind of a non-traditional family life, just in the sense of kind of some dysfunctional family stuff. So high school was pretty hard for me, just kind of trying to get through. I actually skipped a grade, so I ended up graduating high school pretty young. I was 16 when I graduated.
Wow.
And I was pretty, intent on going to college and kind of going straight from high school to college. But mostly it was, because of a family situation and whatnot. So I actually got accepted to college when I was 16, and I went to college when I was 16. So I went to UC Irvine. I went there. I had a full ride scholarship there. So that's kind of what pushed me in that direction. But in regards to support and whatnot, that's something that I think is very interesting about my journey and kind of, makes me a little bit different than other people.
Mhm.
Definitely didn't have really family support. I think mostly just because there really wasn't the means to have support. I kind of come from, a lower socioeconomic status. So not really having financial support, but also just not having family who's educated. And, sometimes that can be difficult when you're trying to be the first person, for example, to go to college or go to medical school. So I was the first person in my extended family actually to even graduate high school. So
Mm.
I was the first person to graduate high school, first person to go to college. So it was kind of a lot of like navigating new waters that I just really wasn't used to.
Wow.
And I definitely say that, in college, I started super young. I actually started as a biomedical engineer. I thought that that's what I wanted to do. I thought that was the way to kind of get to medical school. But I also had to work full time while I was in my undergraduate. So it was something that was really difficult, kind of like I said, paving the way, learning how to be a college student so young, and also just kind of learning how to do it while also having to support yourself was something that was very difficult. So I definitely struggled in college, I think, just not having enough hours in the day basically to get
Right.
everything done. Long story short, that whole thing was pretty windy. I started as a biomedical engineer. I actually ended as a women's studies major, as well as a biological science major. So I was able to double major towards the end, but was also able to kind of explore other things that were interesting to me. And in college, I always tell people, it's a funny story when they ask me how I became a women's studies major. I always say it was an accident. When I decided I
Yeah.
didn't want to do biomedical engineering, it was kind of one of those things of like, oh, I have enough classes. Let's be a women's studies humanities major. And then I ended up loving it. So I ended up sticking with it. And, when the time came to work on my kind of bio prereqs for medical school, I just added bio as a double major. So I was able to graduate from UC Irvine with my BA and my BS, which is something I'm still very proud of.
Yeah.
Luckily, my little sister, she followed pretty quickly behind me. She went to college right after me. So we always like to say we broke the cycle, which is pretty interesting, pretty fun to say. And with that,
Incredible.
yeah, so with that, once I graduated, I took quite a few years off between when I actually graduated from undergraduate and when I applied for medical school. Most of it was financial reasons. Just needed to save up some money to apply. But during that time, I ended up working as a medical assistant for some pretty amazing doctors here in Orange County. And I think that that was really kind of the last fire that I needed to take that step forward in applying to medical school. So I worked, for about 5 or 6 years as a medical assistant before I went to medical school. And it was really, their encouragement that brought me to AUC and got me into medical school, because I think I might have gotten stuck working as a medical assistant a lot longer had it not been for those physicians kind of pushing me along the way. So while I didn't
Yeah.
really have familial support, I've definitely had support from mentors that I've had along the way, and previous bosses that I've worked for and things like that. So definitely been a windy journey, but kind of all worth it to end up here, I think.
Definitely. And before we dive into your experience in medical school, do you have any advice for people in similar situation as your own when they're trying to, get that higher education from a place that doesn't have that support or the means or like the know-how to really get there or do it well without, starting and then falling out and things like that?
Definitely. I think my biggest advice, and if I could go back and maybe talk to my younger self, I would probably give this advice as well. Is to find a mentor, and I think that that's only part of it, because you actually have to listen to your mentor.
Yeah.
So there are many times, where
Step
people
two.
would tell me, yes, people would tell me, oh, you should do this or you should do that, and I definitely maybe just thought I had a better way to do it. But when you're the first person and you're kind of the trailblazer, you really do need to take advice from people who have lived that life before and who have gone down that path before. And if your parents, for example, can't give you that guidance and other people are willing to give that to you, I think my best advice is, put all ego, all pride aside and really take to heart what these people are telling you. And I think that I probably, maybe when I was younger was a little bit more stubborn than I am now. And I think looking back at that time, I would say, drop all the stubbornness, drop the pride, drop the ego. These people who are willing to help you, make sure that you take that help from them, and
Mhm.
make sure that you take it to heart, and definitely value any mentorship that you can get, because those people will be the support that you need.
Absolutely. Do you remember any one piece of advice that really stuck out to you or helped shape your um, trajectory?
I mean, as easy as it is, just like this small keep going sort of advice. That's the sort of advice I've always gotten. And a lot of times I think in the heat of things, if things aren't going right for you, or let's just say, you don't have the financial means to take the next step, or whatever it might be. I do think that the very easy keep going sort of mentality is really the best piece of advice that I've gotten. Not giving up, or people saying you've made it this far, you can't just stop there. I think that's the best advice that I can give to other people. And while it might seem, oh, that's so silly, of course I'm going to keep going. It's really important to remember that mental fortitude is kind of a big part of medical school, and having sort of that mental resilience to get through tough things it really will benefit you in the future, I think, especially as a
Mhm.
physician. And looking back, people constantly telling me keep going and giving me that support, being that cheerleader for me. That's probably the best advice that I got, and really probably the only piece of advice I really took to heart.
Yeah.
To keep going and keep fighting. There's always a means to the end. There's always some solution. It might not be the solution that you originally thought of. It might not be a solution that you want, but there is always a solution. And if you're willing to take whatever comes your way, and you're willing to take the solutions, whether or not they fall in line with what you want, you will get to where you want to be. So I think it's just keep going, be brave, and take any solution that comes your way, because that's what's going to take to get to the next step.
Amazing. Can you tell us more about your experiences in medical school once you finally got there?
Yes. So once I finally got there, we've actually had quite a ride at AUC. I'm
Yeah.
sure many people have heard of it. So I was definitely in the class who got to experience Hurricane Irma, which is still
Mm.
to date the highest or most intense recorded Atlantic hurricane that's ever been recorded, basically. So that happened at the transition between my second and third semester during my basic sciences. So the island of St. Martin was rocked by Hurricane Irma. I was on student government during that time, along with some of my other friends who were also MAR ambassadors. We were all in student government during that time, and really kind of stepped in as student leaders to really. I don't want to say that we did all the work, but we definitely did a large part of the work in
Yeah.
coordinating student life, and making sure, for example, that like our student experience was not ruined, making sure our medical curriculum wasn't actually interrupted or anything like that. So there was definitely a period of time, right after the hurricane and the initial kind of aftershock of it, where no one knew what was going on, right? We were all, people had been evacuated from the island. We're obviously all without our homes and our things that are all on the island. And everyone was kind of at home, just sitting around being like, what comes next?
Right.
So that was an interesting time period. And there was a lot of talk about maybe we'll go here or maybe we'll go there. And really, they ended up settling in the United Kingdom. So we ended up being about an hour north of Manchester.
Mm.
So we basically just picked all of our stuff up and moved from the island and moved to the UK. And just as a kind of a time frame, that all happened within about a month from the time that the hurricane happened to the time that we landed in the UK. It was really only about a month, so it was a very quick turnaround. Obviously, we went to the UK, kind of had to like restart our lives there. We were very lucky to have a university there in Preston called UCLan, who basically housed us there, gave us housing, welcomed us into their facilities with open arms. It was probably one of the most endearing experiences, just to see this like tiny little college town open their arms up to about 700 medical students, right, coming from St. Martin. So
Wonderful.
that was, yeah, it was very interesting. It was an interesting time period. It was super stressful, obviously, just kind of having to stay on track with your studies and get it, acclimated to a new climate, a new place. But it ended up being, I don't know, for me at least, I ended up it being a blessing in disguise for the most part. I had a wonderful time in the UK. My class ended up actually being the last class in the UK, so they kind of phased people back into St. Martin as the island got ready. My class ended up being the only one that never got phased back to the island, so we ended up completing our studies actually in the UK.
Yeah.
So I always say like we were the last class, right? We were the last forgotten class, I sometimes call us,
Right.
because we were the ones that were left in the UK. Everyone else was back in St. Martin at that time. So it was interesting, and there was definitely a lot of adjustments to do. But it was a good time, and I think that our school handled it, well. I think that they got us to the UK, they got us into housing, they got us right back into classes. So I think AUC did a pretty good job at, keeping things pretty seamless. Us as student government leaders, obviously, we're also working pretty hard behind the scenes to make sure that things just kind of continue to go smoothly. And like I said, it ended up being a blessing in disguise. A lot of us got to do a lot of traveling, for example, that we never thought we would get to do. Once you're in Europe, it's pretty easy to get around. So it was fun. After exams, people would go to different countries together. There was a lot of fun that was had on top of it. So that's why I call it a blessing in disguise.
Yeah.
But that was, yeah, so that was the first part. Obviously, COVID, I don't think I need to talk too much about that since we've all been impacted by COVID. But obviously, COVID happened for me at least in the transition between my third and fourth year. So definitely messed up, some things during my fourth year, for example, doing away rotations, which is something I
Mhm.
was looking forward to. But otherwise, like I said, I think that, with COVID, we've all had to learn to adjust. We've all had to learn to kind of, redo everything that we're used to doing. And it was interesting being a medical student during that time and kind of being in the hospital during that time. And I'm definitely grateful for the experience that I had during that time. I think that it strengthened me, showed me different things that I obviously never thought that I would see in my lifetime. And it's interesting to be a part of history as well. To be kind of on the front lines as a medical student has taught me quite a bit. So definitely been a wild ride through medical school. We've been through quite a bit. At AUC, I know people at Ross had a very similar experience, with Hurricane Maria. So definitely has been quite a ride. But the word of our graduation class and our graduating class is resiliency. I think that all of us have shown pretty great resiliency in the sense that we've not only gone through the hurricane, some transcontinental moves, but also kind of graduating during the COVID time has been pretty interesting. So it's
Yeah,
definitely been a wild
unprecedented.
ride.
Yeah. And where did taking the steps 1 and 2 fall into this journey for you? Was that during medical school? How did you prepare for those?
Yes. So I did take them during medical school. Step one, I took about, I believe, 2 months after I was done with my basic sciences. So once I got back from the UK, I came home. I had some dedicated study time, and I took step one between my second and my third year. So I
Mhm.
had taken my step one before I had started my clinical rotations, and then step two, I actually was the first wave of people who had CS canceled for them. So I actually never took CS, but was planning to take it in March of 2020. So it makes sense that I was kind of the first wave of people to get the boot on taking CS. So I didn't end up taking CS. And with CK2, CK was pretty difficult to take. I had originally had it scheduled to take it in spring of 2020. And with COVID, I think it was canceled and rescheduled 4 times. So I think the fourth
Okay.
time was the charm. So I ended up taking it later than I was anticipating, but luckily was still able to take it prior to when ERAS opened and applications went out. So I believe I ended up taking CK. I was meant to take it in March. I believe I ended up taking it in August. So much later than anticipated, and obviously had many cancellations along the way, but definitely had that done kind of right before my ERAS application went out. And in regards to how I prepared, I know that was the second part of the question.
Yeah.
My biggest things are always to not get resourceitis. That's what I call it, where you use too many resources and things get kind of bogged down. So my biggest thing is I tried to stick to a few resources. So for step one, UWorld was a big thing for me. I think that's a big thing for everybody. But I've always been someone who really relied, for example, on my class notes and things like that. And I truly believe that doing well in your basic sciences classes is the best way to study for step one. And that's
Mhm.
kind of the mentality that I took kind of coming into medical school was if I do well in classes, then I'll know the material. If I know the material, it's less for me to have to review. And I do think that that was probably the best thing that I did was taking all my classes seriously, trying to do really well in them, and just getting that good foundational knowledge. That way, when the time finally came, I could really focus on UWorld and doing questions and focusing at least just on doing questions. It was less about doing review. And then for CK, there's obviously plenty of resources out there. UWorld again, kind of a big one, but also using things like online med ed. That's something that I really appreciated.
Yeah.
Having some videos and things like that. And also books like Step Up to Medicine is one of my absolute favorite books in the entire world. Like I'm going to put that in my, future library one day. And I think it's a great study book. So I think there's plenty of, resources out there. The biggest thing for me, at least, is not to have too many, right? Find one that works for you and stick with that. And I think that's kind of the best way to go about studying, at least from my perspective.
And then how did you start the application process once you were done with step 1 and step 2 and you're ready to start applying to programs? How did that
Yeah.
work for you?
That's a great question. So obviously there's multiple different parts of getting ready for applications. So one is obviously getting your application ready. And another big part is too is figuring out which programs to actually apply to. So I kind of separated them up, I guess, into different little sections. So it was a little easier to tackle. So in regards to actually, preparing my application, my biggest thing is I started early. So I'm pretty sure, and about this time last year was when I was working, for example, on my personal statement. And I was working on making sure I had all my letters of recs lined up and things like that, just kind of staying organized. But in regards to looking for programs, that's kind of how I found Match Your Resident. I found Match Your Resident to be probably the most valuable tool for looking at programs because, to be honest, I did not know how to look at programs. You look at any other resource and it's just kind of a list, right? Here's a list of different programs and here's how we think you might, fare if you apply there. Versus Match Your Resident, I just found it to be much more personal. I was able to go and read people's experiences that they had during interviews. And especially this year when we had virtual interviews, it was nice to hear other people's experiences during non-COVID years so that I kind of got a vibe of how that program was before I even applied there. So I definitely use Match Your Resident. I use the ranking system to kind of see which programs I would be most compatible with. It definitely helped me to put programs into like, are these reach programs? Are these programs that are good programs that I fit with? And are these good backup programs for me? So it helped me kind of make those three categories and make sure that I had enough programs in each one. So I think for that aspect, using Match Your Resident is very important. And in regards to actually getting your application, start early and get organized is the biggest thing because the more time that you have, the more eyes you can have on it, and the
Mhm.
more feedback that you can get from other people about your application and how it can be improved. So now would be a good time, I think, definitely to start
Right.
thinking about getting started on things like personal
Definitely.
statements and MSPE letters and letters of rec.
So how many programs did you end up applying to?
So I ended up applying to right at that 100 mark. I know there are people who dual apply and apply to a lot more. I was pretty insistent that I was going to go into internal medicine, so I only
Yeah.
applied internal medicine, and I applied to about 100 programs. So I would say out of those, the large majority of them I found through Match Your Resident. So I applied to about 100. And that's also too based on me speaking to my school and them looking at my statistics based, on other people's, and that was kind of the number that we had settled on. Um, Looking back, did I need to apply to 100 programs? I'm not sure, but I think for IMGs, it is definitely a number game, and we definitely do need to remember that we do need to apply to more programs than the average, U.S. for example, applicants.
Mhm. How did your interview experiences go once you started getting some of those interviews?
It was very interesting. So I was nervous, I think like everybody else, just, the biggest thing I was nervous about was, am I going to be able to understand this program's culture? Am I going to be able to understand this program's vibe, through the screen? Because for me,
Mm.
that was my number one priority that I was looking at, was location, but also comfortability. Am I going to be comfortable here? Am I going to thrive here? Are these people that I'm going to want to spend, 16 hours a day with? So I was nervous about that at first, but I will say I think that even with virtual interviews, programs did such a great job of finding different ways to show us their personality. So
Mhm.
for example, I wasn't anticipating, all of the virtual happy hours, for example. And those ended up being the most fun part, I think, of the application process because a lot of these programs, would do virtual happy hours the day before or the week before. I even had some programs send out like cocktail menus of drinks that you could
Wow.
make that were named after people in their program, for example. So people definitely went above and beyond, I think, to show us their personality. And I think for me with virtual interviews, I definitely did a practice interview with someone from my school over the screen first to make sure, I knew where to look. I knew, and not to talk with my hands like this, for example. So I think definitely doing the practice interview was super helpful. But once I got there and got into the interviews, I think I realized that it was actually pretty comfortable. And most people were very cognizant of the fact that this is all new to us. Doing things virtually is new. So there definitely was just a lot of laxity in the interviews. I felt like there was a lot of emphasis on making sure we were comfortable and that, as applicants, we weren't too nervous, for example, about technology or things going wrong. So I had a very positive experience with doing interviews virtually, especially someone like me who, has to work full time when they're not in school. Also, saving that money to not have to fly to programs was a huge, huge advantage for me, at least this
Mm.
year. Because I was definitely worried I wouldn't be able to take all the interviews that I may or may not get because of cost. So I think that it's a good way to obviously allow people to take the interviews that they're offered, without having to worry so much about the financial burden of getting to that actual interview. So I had a good time. I think, I feel that my interviews would have gone the same had I been in person, just in the sense of comfortability and how I answered questions and whatnot. And a lot of programs did tell me that they were considering making virtual interviews kind of a mainstay of ERAS season. So
Wow.
I could definitely see this going forward. Again, with the pluses are the fact that you don't have to spend as much money. The negatives, you obviously have to be a little bit more in tune to make sure that you can actually get a vibe from the programs, right? And you have to come prepared with questions that are important to you. Because, for example, you don't get to see the hospitals in person. So you have to have questions ready. What is my schedule going to look like? Do I have food stipends? Do I have on call rooms, places for me to sleep, things that normally you would see when you went to a hospital.
Mhm.
So again, I think just being prepared was something that also fared well for me during interview season, is just having those questions prepared.
What would you tell people who are getting ready for the virtual interviews for this upcoming cycle in terms of preparing for the interviews or helping get their actual physical setup done correctly, things like that?
Absolutely. So I will say the physical setup portion, what I did, I did buy a new camera that I just attached to my computer. It just helped improve my sound quality and obviously helped improve my actual camera quality. And I did also purchase a ring light. So I had that sitting kind of right in front of me. I did also kind of have, make sure I had a blank background, nothing too busy in the background. And again, just try to make sure that you're in a quiet place, make sure that you are in a comfortable place, and just kind of make sure that you're somewhere that you're not going to be, like I said, interrupted, or people aren't going to come barging in or anything like that. That's kind of the first part of it. But in regards to actually preparing, I think if you can do any sort of practice interview, whether it be something official through your school, or whether it just be someone on the other end that can look at you and make sure that you are looking, like I said, in the right places, that you're not speaking too loudly or anything like that, that you're clear and things like that. So a practice interview, I think, is very, very vital to understanding how to use all of your technology and make sure that your setup is okay. But on top of that, too, I know that there are some people who will try to prepare questions ahead of time. I focus less on preparing answers to questions because I didn't want to sound too rehearsed, and instead focused on having a lot of real life examples. So I sat down and I thought about patient stories or things that have happened to me in my life that are very much, could be used to answer any question. Because I do believe that when you answer questions, you should always show something, right, versus just tell them. So I tried to come up with a lot of different scenarios, different, like I said, patient scenarios where maybe I was in a tough situation with a patient, or I had to break bad news to a patient, or whatever it might be, or how you interact with your coworkers, potentially in a previous work environment, things like that. I tried to have a lot of real life examples prepared so that when I was actually answering questions, I had those examples kind of on the tip of my tongue to be like, well, instead of me telling you that I'm a leader, let me give you an example of when I
Mhm.
demonstrated leadership in the workplace. So I think that having those stories and those examples ready was very key for me. But again, not over practicing. You don't want to sound over rehearsed. I think the only question I really practiced to myself was, tell us about yourself, because obviously that's kind of your elevator story, right? They always tell you should be able to answer this in about a minute or so. So I definitely practiced that question. But other than that, I really kind of tried to just answer the questions as they came at me and utilized those examples that I had previously thought of to use to answer questions.
Did you get any feedback after the interviews about the experience or how you answered specific questions or things like that from
Yeah,
programs?
I did actually. So a lot of times you get very instant feedback, obviously, when you're sitting right in front of someone. So I would have people be like, wow, that's such an interesting story. And especially with my very first kind of elevator spiel, I feel like that actually was the catapult or the catalyst for many conversations with people. So that initial question, which comes up on almost every interview, is very important. And so I tried to make mine interesting. For example, something I haven't mentioned yet, I actually worked in the music industry for quite a bit of time when I
Okay.
was an undergraduate. So I included that in my little spiel about me. And almost every single person would stop me in the middle and be like, wait, I'm sorry. What? You worked in the music industry? Tell me more. So definitely having a hook, for example, was something I got a lot of good feedback on. And people just loved it. They ate it up. Like it was like I can't tell you how many strange and interesting and fun conversations that little spiel led to. A lot of times too, interviews ended up just being conversations. There wasn't even really any questions. And I felt like that was because of my first initial how I answered this question, and I gave them a lot to kind of hook on to. But
Hmm.
there was a lot of times too where people would say, "Thank you for giving me an example," and that's why I think that that's really important, and especially too in any sort of post-interview communication. If that's allowed, first of all, that's the number one thing. There's some programs who don't allow any post-interview communication, so don't obviously disobey that. But any program that didn't have issues with post-interview communication, I would definitely send an email to. I would thank them. I would give them specific, feedback from my interview where I would say, I love when we talked about X, Y, and Z, or I love when you asked me this and I had the chance to share this part of my story. And almost every person would email back, and you could tell that it was a memorable thing because they would be like, "Oh, yes, that was so great getting to learn this about you." And I even had some people who would ask me follow up questions in my actual post interview communication. So I think definitely like using those examples that I was talking about earlier, I think that that was a big plus for me. And a lot of people did comment, for example, on like, "Thank you for giving me an actual example versus just, answering my question and whatnot." So you do get a lot of instant feedback. And like I said, too, a lot of times interviews will kind of just spiral based on something interesting that you've said about yourself. So definitely keep that in mind, especially when answering that first question, which is tell us about yourself. Give them some interesting things to grab onto.
Yeah, I love that advice to
Yes.
give them something juicy to then even help direct the rest of the conversation with.
Yes. And I will tell you, like every conversation, I feel like got directed in a positive way because people were just so interested in learning more about me. And I thought that that was really interesting and really, it was really cool to be honest. And I took note of programs that were very much like, tell me more about yourself and let's hear more about your journey. Because for me, that was what I was looking for in a program, someone who really holistically cared about me and someone who, really cared to know about my story and what got me here. So definitely take notes of those things too, because I think that those are good gut feelings, that you can kind of tangibly go with. You can say, I had a good feeling about these people because they so much focused on me and what I had to bring to the table. So it's a good way to get a good vibe from the program as well, I think.
Hmm. In what ways do you see yourself moving forward with your career now that you've gotten into residency and you're about to start?
So I know I'm so excited. So I definitely see myself. I'm still, I will say, I'm on the fence about what I want to do after residency. So whether or not I want to act as a hospitalist, I will say I have learned during my clinical rotations that I am an inpatient gal for sure. So like that's something I'd learned about myself during clinical rotation. So I could see myself as a hospitalist, definitely, but I can see myself specializing as well. So like I had mentioned previously, endocrinology is something I'm interested in. I think it's a natural thing for me, just being a type 1 diabetic. Obviously, that gives you an interesting vantage point, right, to deal with endocrine patients. So I think that that's something that does kind of call to me. But I will say too, cardiology really calls to me. That was my last rotation in medical school. I absolutely loved it. I didn't think I would love it as much as I did. It was kind of a shocker. So I'm still kind of sitting with that, and maybe that's something that during residency I'll be able to figure out doing, rotations through endocrinology, through cardio, and maybe there'll be something else that I rotate through that I'm really excited about. So I'm definitely trying to keep an open mind, but I can definitely see myself, going forward and specializing in something. I'm just not 100% sure what yet, but I would say something in that realm would not surprise me. Cardio, endo, hospitalist, maybe one of those things.
Yeah, we'll just have to check back with you and after the
Let's
first
go.
few months of residency and see how things are going.
Yes,
Uh,
absolutely.
so, for residency applicants or just anybody who's interested in medicine or even just higher education, do you have advice for those people out there?
I do. I think that if you want to pursue any, like you said, any kind of higher education, you really got to love it, right? It's going to be hard work, no matter what you do. It's going to be hard. No matter how smart you are, no matter how hard you work, no matter what background you come from, it's going to be difficult. So I think just going in and realizing that if you're working towards something that you love and you want to do, then those difficult times are all going to be worth it. And I can say that wholeheartedly looking back at the last 4 years. There definitely been a lot of fun times, but they've been very difficult years. But looking back at it, while those times were difficult and it was hard to deal with the hurricane and moving and COVID and obviously all of that on top of how hard medical school is in general. Now that I'm here, it's completely worth it. And there have been so many times along the way. And I think anyone who, has reached this point in their training will say, I can't tell you how many times I've wanted to quit. And that's really the difference, between someone who's really invested and someone who might not be. If you are really invested in something, it's going to be difficult, right? Nothing in life that's worth having comes easy. So work hard and just keep going. And there will be times where you want to quit. There have been many where I wanted to quit. And there have been many times, where I have been in tears and I've been like, I can't do this or whatever it might be. And just kind of finding that inner strength to move forward and realizing that this is a small blip in such a large picture and you're going to have such a large impact on the world, and that these small moments where you don't feel good enough, where you feel that imposter syndrome is creeping in, you've worked really hard for this, and it will all come to fruition at the end once you get into residency and you get to actually practice medicine. So keep on going. And those times where you feel like quitting, that's the times that you need to rely on the people around you and rely on your support system, rely on your friends or your family, whoever it might be, but definitely just lean on them and get through it, right? Because quitting is not going to be something. I believe that if you really want to be a doctor or you really want to be in higher education, quitting is going to be something that you're going to regret. So just, you have to find the strength to pick it up and keep on going, because there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And I feel like I finally reached a little bit of it. So I do feel like I can confidently say, like, there are so many times where I just couldn't see that light, or I couldn't see the horizon. I felt like I was never going to get there. And now I'm here. So it's kind of one of those things where, in hindsight, looking back, looking at those people, it's just keep going. The horizon is just not as far as it seems, right? You're going to get there.
Yeah, it's amazing advice. And I can say that you're definitely an inspiration to so many people out there.
Thank you.
Chelsea is a Match Resident Ambassador. So we thank you for sharing all this information and, in the future for helping us disseminate knowledge
Of
and
course.
inspiration for people. Is there any way that people can keep in contact with you through social media?
Yes. So I'm pretty active on my Instagram. So my Instagram is just chelseaazevedo.md. I did just add that. So that's also a fun benefit of when you finally graduate, you can add MD to your Instagram
All right.
handle.
Yes.
Yes, that was what we were aiming to do. But I'm always there, and I'm definitely, my messages are always available for people if they have questions about anything. So I'm always available. Please reach out to me and stay in touch.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you.